Well, still on the unfortunate associated airline crash, Tunde Irukera joins us. He's a lawyer as well as an aviation expert. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm sure you saw Captain Mohammed Badimoso. We've been talking about air safety and airworthiness, but again, we'll come back to the Dana issue because the story broke late last night, that that particular license has actually been suspended for the airline. But for this associated airline crash, I'm sure you must have been thinking, because we've talked about air safety and airworthiness countless of times on this program. What comes to mind when you heard this?
Well, you know, I'm a lawyer, and I'm thinking what went wrong and who's possibly liable. That's what I'm thinking. And then the theory of law is pretty simple. When you've been injured, which includes bodily injury and possibly death, you would look for who is responsible, either directly or remotely.
That brings us to insurance, I guess.
And that would bring, well, of course, insurance becomes a matter. And for the most part, there's absolutely no way that it won't be the carrier who will carry the primary responsibility. And it makes sense that if the carrier carries primary responsibility for liability, the carrier also would carry primary responsibility for safety. You have I mean, typically in scheduled operations, you have a contract of carriage. And the contract of carriage is that you have an understanding with the airline that they would carry you in a safe manner from your current location to your proposed destination. And so what essentially that means is that there's a bunch of different things that happen in between that, which includes the airworthiness and all that. And so what the carrier is saying is, I will do everything required to transport you safely. A few times when a carrier would possibly diminish liability, and that would be when you can show by overwhelming evidence that the carrier has done everything possible to transport you safely. It's hard to tell what the deal was at this point with this accident, not knowing the vast majority of what happened. But I don't see any way where the carrier is going to get away from this. And in most cases, even when you think about who's remotely and who's directly responsible, the carrier is almost always directly responsible. Now, if there are other players, many times a facility creator, I mean, someone who maintains an infrastructure. For instance, if there's an airport infrastructure that failed, if you have a bad runway or something, and so those are all the things you would look at. But in this situation, from what I've heard, it appears entirely to be a matter of the equipment, the aircraft itself, or who knows, maybe the operators of the equipment. And so it seems pretty firm that it would be the carrier who carries responsibility.
You know, is it a given that once you bought an aircraft, charter or regular commercial flight, you're already insured by the carrier?
It is supposed to be so, I mean, without question. Now, there's a difference between a charter operation and a scheduled operation. A scheduled operation, for the most part, we passengers really don't exercise a great level of choice. I mean, you can make a choice between what airline you want to travel with, but as far as that's about the only choice you have. In charter operations, you literally determine by yourself that I want you to take me. I want you to take me at this time, and I want you to take me to this location. So, I mean, the scrutiny is somewhat very different from an oversight standpoint. But without question, whichever way, you would need to maintain insurance. Now, the level of insurance may sometimes be different in the sense that there are international conventions and domestic statutes that say that, look, for scheduled carriers, this is the minimum you have to carry, because these people don't have a choice. But when you're chartering an aircraft, it's your obligation to look into all that and make a determination whether you're satisfied.
Well, as you rightly said, that, you know, sometimes Nigerians are helpless when it comes to issues like this. Now, let's talk about the umbrella body that overlooks everything aviation now, the aviation ministry. How can they help in situations like this when it comes to compensation or claims?
The reality of it is requiring the government to take a role in the question of liability itself is a misnomer.
Why?
Because typically, in any proper environment, I mean, the issues are pretty clear. I own an aircraft, I operate the aircraft. whether by something I failed to do or didn't do, something has happened, you're a passenger on that aircraft, it's open and close. My liability is to you. And in a situation where I'm failing in discharging my responsibilities under that liability, the court system should come in. So it is the unusual thing to look to a government to say, listen, get in here. But I understand why it happens here, because obviously I suppose we're evolving in our structures. And I suppose the reason why it is very predominant here is government has a lot of power. And so people depend on government that, listen, you can use your authority to enforce our rights. Essentially, for instance, this is an operator that's subject to the licensee of the government. So the government says, you know what, if you do not treat people right, I would make sure that you cannot exercise the privileges under that license. So that in itself adds some impetus. In a place like the United States, it hardly ever comes to that, because you would sue. And you have what you call liability limits on insurance. And insurance must immediately step up to the ball and take care of everything. If they do not do it in a sensible manner, they waive the liability limits, in which case whatever a jury awards, regardless of whether it's the limit of liability or not, the insurance company becomes responsible for that. So there are other factors in the system that make people step up to their responsibility.
One of the key factors will be the role, you talked about the role of the government. In this case now, how would you describe the role of the government as the Ministry of Aviation here?
The Ministry of Aviation, I'm not sure it has any direct role.
In terms of regulation, monitoring, ensuring that things are done as they should be.
Well, you have an autonomous civil aviation authority. When you have an autonomous civil aviation authority, that is the regulatory entity. The Ministry of Aviation is responsible to the executive, which is the president, advises the president on that. So for the most part, what the Ministry of Aviation does is to coordinate the operations of government agencies within the aviation sector and to set policy. And then the parastatals, including the Civil Aviation Authority, must go ahead and implement the policies that is set by the Ministry of Aviation. So the Ministry of Aviation also is the interface between the NCAA and the President. So the NCAA would be able to advise the Ministry of Aviation on what is going on regulatorily, the trend worldwide, and that would assist in setting policy. And in turn, the Ministry of Aviation supervises the agencies, but not necessarily
in
engages
this case
in
now, the area of the policy now. How would you say the policies have been? Would you say the policies have been enough to both positively affect the air travelers in Nigeria and their operators?
Well, there's really so much you can do with proposing policy that is diametrically different from what happens in the rest of the world, especially when you talk about issues of safety and all that. It's pretty much plus or minus the same thing that goes on around the world. And what would be what policy can you impose from a safety standpoint? Have an autonomous civil aviation authority, have the right law and all the regulations, and support the Civil Aviation Authority to enforce those laws and regulations as best as they can. Okay. And so that's what the policy should be. Now, with respect to passenger experiences, yeah, the policy should be, well, you know what, we're concerned about consumer protection. And that has been an issue. I mean, I think that I participated in writing the consumer protection regulations. So as far as that, I'm satisfied that it is obviously a front burner issue. But with respect to safety, it would be to support the Civil Aviation Authority to adopt the the global safety standards.
Yeah, because you talked about, you said when this crash occurred, the first thing that came to your mind is what could have gone wrong and who's liable.
Yes.
And liability could come from anywhere. I mean, the pilot who was talking earlier said that it could even be as a result of somebody not doing their job properly, even on the runway. So, in terms of safety, since the Dana crash, would you say that a lot more has been done? I mean, a lot more stringent rules has been put in place to make sure that safety becomes topmost priority for all airlines. From what you have observed,
I suspect that is the case. I mean, and I'll tell you why. And the first thing that I remember is that for the longest time, Dana could not return to the air. I believe the government...
Even though they admit that that was a mistake on their part.
Whose part? I didn't get that.
We remember very clearly because immediately then the license of Dana was revoked. And we remember again that they said that, you know, that wasn't what they ought to have done.
I mean the government?
Yes, the government.
Well, my recollection is they suspended Dana's operations. And I believe that was out of an abundance of caution. And what it was understandably, Dana flies a homogeneous fleet. And so their point was,